who don't know me, I'm Libby Lundstrom. I'm a professor in the Darky department. I've been co-organizing the Critical Border Studies series with David Moffat, who couldn't be here today. He's a PhD candidate in the sociology department. This is our last formal talk of the Critical Border Studies speaker series of the year, and we're going to end it on a very high note with Peter Nyers. Peter is a very good friend of York, and in fact a graduate of York, did his PhD here in political science. Now he's an associate professor of the politics of citizenship and industrial relations.
Intercultural relations.
Intercultural relations, sorry. Yeah, industrial would bring out a different meaning there. Intercultural relations at McMaster University. And he teaches and does research in the areas of critical security studies, international relations theory, citizenship studies, and refugee migration politics. And he's published very widely in these areas. He's very well respected, and we're very lucky to have him here today. So please join me as we welcome Professor Peter Nyers.
Well, thanks, Libby, for that introduction, and to Chris as well for the invitation to be a part of this Critical Border Studies speaker series. It's always great to be back at York and at York Lanes. I spent many years in this room and the one next to it doing coursework and talks and conferences and all that, so it's nice to be back here. Today I'm going to be talking about the politics of dirt. Specifically in the context of securitized border zones. And this is a new project. I've been working on it with a PhD student at McMaster, Sarah Bayton. We've been working on it for about a year now, and the way we started off, we were looking at, we're doing some research on material objects, the kind that you would find in border areas and border sites. And we were quickly struck, and we were quite unprepared for this, but how often references to dirt and to soil came up in our investigations. And once we started to dig around, as it were, and explore these cases, we realized that dirt wasn't just this object of discourse, something that people spoke about. And neither was it just a resource. Something that was mobilized by state officials to fortify the territorial border. In many of the cases we looked at, and I'm going to talk about a couple today, we noticed that dirt kind of took on a life of its own. And in this strange way, it became a kind of actor of sorts, one of many in these contested border sites. So what my talk today is... it's an initial attempt to make sense of the agency of dirt in border zones, and the research is still at this very early and preliminary stage. So I'm grateful to have this opportunity to communicate some of our initial findings and hopefully get some feedback. Now I have to admit that this focus on dirt, I'm not really quite sure what to make or what to do with this project, because it represents something of a departure for me. As Libby says, my research typically focuses not on the objects of border zones, but on its subjects. My interest in border politics comes from a broader concern about how people are made and unmade as citizens, as non-citizens, as foreigners, and as strangers in the context of borders. So, for example, over the past decade, I've done a lot of work on the emerging forms of political subjectivity that arise in the context of anti-deportation campaigns or anti-detention campaigns by non-status refugees and migrants. And what I've shown in my research on that topic is that the struggles by refugees and migrants against detention and deportation, and more positively, for the regularization of their status and for global mobility rights, have debunked some of our most cherished assumptions about political subjectivity. While we're used to seeing refugees and migrants from the lens of victimage, right, and expecting a certain degree of helplessness or dependency from these people, Recent theorizations of citizenship are challenging these assumptions. I'm thinking here of the work done by Kim Rigel, who I believe was one of the speakers this past year, Anne McNevin, Leah Bassel, Vicky Squire, Engen Eisen, and there's many others. They're showing that migrants caught in these securitized border zones are nonetheless capable of constituting themselves as political subjects in their negotiations, contestations, and evasions of the border. And I think what's exciting about these studies is how they are challenging the traditional view of citizenship as a kind of formal, as only being a formal legal status, and instead emphasize how, in addition to being a formal legal status, citizenship also involves the enactment of political subjectivity. And sometimes these acts of citizenship can take place through the most unexpected, unfamiliar, and irregular subjects, these acts made by non-citizens. So citizenship, rather than being a status of that something you either have or don't, is actually this contested site of struggle around political subjectivity. And then there are some other scholars, and especially those working within what's often called the autonomy of migration perspective, people like Sandro Mitzadra or Dimitris Papadopoulos, who argue that, somewhat controversially, that there's something primary about human movement, and that borders and the various apparatuses of containment and control only come afterwards. So, we typically think of migrants as confronting borders, right? Something that they, in their movements that they come up against and they have to negotiate. But this autonomy of migration perspective, challenges us to think that, in a way, borders are always following migrants as well. They're being forced to adapt to the inventiveness of the strategies that humans take in their international mobility. So I think that literature challenges our assumptions about the relationship between territory, border controls, and movement. So it's not only the refugee or migrant who is the mobile agent at the border, but it's also the border itself that moves. Within the critical security studies literature, there's been some very interesting work on the proliferation of these kind of mobile forms of borders. But most of that research has been on mobile borders that are enacted in their like virtual or digital forms. Louisa Moore, Ben Mueller, who also talked here, yeah, you guys bring in everyone, have done some really great work on this topic through their research on like biometric controls and dataveillance. They look at how the border follows the migrant around through these virtual and digital technologies. But there's been comparatively little analysis of the movement of borders in material terms. This is precisely what I want to talk about today. So when I speak of the moving border, I mean exactly that. I mean the movement of territory, the dirt, the soil that constitutes the territorial borderline. And as we'll see in the case studies that I'll be talking about in a moment, in these contexts, smuggling takes on a whole new meaning, and it becomes quite literal. It's not only people and goods that are being smuggled across the border, but it's the border itself, which is actually in movement. So the question I want to interrogate today is, how can we evaluate the significance of the movement of a material object, in this case, soil, dirt, that constitutes the territorial border? Within IR, I found that the recent work and some discussions I've had with these people like William Walters, Claudia Eredau, and Mark Salter has been quite inspirational on this question. These scholars have been trying to get some critical distance from the assumption that agency is the exclusive domain of human subjects. So in their own distinctive ways, they ask this provocative, some might say audacious question. How do objects speak? and thereby call into question the hegemony that humans have claimed over political voice and agency. Now, objects are not usually afforded any sort of agency, but are almost always used or guided by human actors. But human actors are only ever part of a broader assemblage of human and non-human actors, or what Jane Bennett describes in her very influential recent book, Vibrant Matter: A Political Ecology of Things, as the spectrum of agentic capacities. From this perspective, humans and things, or objects, are both co-present and co-constitutive of the world in which we inhabit. Objects, Bennett argues, are animated by what she calls thing power. That is, the curious ability to animate, this is a quote, the curious ability to animate, to act, to produce effects, both dramatic and subtle. Thing power, she goes on to say, draws attention to an efficacy of objects in excess of human meanings, designs, or purposes they express or serve. So what Bennett and others are doing is attempting to theorize things or objects not as fixed or reified, but as possessing a kind of force or an energy or an intensity of their own. Now, empirically, it would seem that the terrain of security studies would be an ideal place to do this kind of investigation of objects, because security studies is rich in material objects to analyze from this perspective. There's the classic objects of war and strategic studies, guns and bombs, castles and bunkers, barbed wire, and air raid sirens. But there are also objects that speak to more contemporary forms of securitization, passports and biometric scanners, CCTV cameras that survey city spaces. The first aid kits or the water bottles, maps, or knapsacks that undocumented migrants carry with them. So there's plenty of objects to interrogate within security studies. But there's also some serious epistemological challenges involved with this kind of research. The main one being that objects or things do not readily speak for themselves. As Nietzsche, but I'm always one of my favorite quotes by Nietzsche in The Great Science is that he says, we're looking for words. Perhaps we should also be looking for ears. And I think perhaps he's right in this respect. Maybe we can push the boundaries of political agency by seeking out the effects of objects, looking at those forces or intensities that Bennett talked about, and listening to what they might have to say despite their speechlessness. So what I'd like to contribute to this emerging debate is to map out the movement of objects from the banal to the exceptional by investigating the movement of dirt in border zones. And dirt, after all, is this evocative descriptor for border politics. It adheres to this classical image of the border as this kind of line in the sand. But it's also something quite literal. It's, omnipresent. Dirt can it both covers the boots of unauthorized migrants, but also the boots and clothing of border patrol alike. It kind of appears everywhere at the border. So I'm going to get into my cases, which I think will illustrate much more concretely what I'm trying to get at here. But I thought I'd just repeat to be clear, or try to be clear, what the main problematic or question of the talk is. And that is, if objects or things can have a force or direction of their own that isn't always or entirely controlled, directed, or predictable by human beings, how might dirt have a force or direction of its own? And what are the political lessons that we can learn from dirt? So to get at this question, I analyzed two cases involving the movement of dirt, soil, and earth in border zones. One case involves the movement of dirt to the border. The other involves the removal of dirt from the border. And in each case, I want to suggest that the movement of dirt raises some fundamental questions about the historically shifting meanings of land and territory, of soil and earth, and their relationship to political identity, community, and sovereignty. Okay, so the first case involves the movement of tons of dirt to fill the canyons, valleys, gullies, and other so-called border corridors along the U.S.-Mexico border. And the movement of this dirt is part of the construction of 700 miles of new border fencing that was mandated by the 2006 Secure Fence Act in the United States. This is being done to fulfill the state's desire to striate the border by creating a kind of a smooth space upon which to build physical fortifications, new border posts, but also fences, roads, bridges, and so on. I think it's worthwhile to consider the operational aims of this Secure Fence Act. The aims are twofold. The first one is that it seeks to create, enhance, or fortify barriers to prevent unauthorized border crossings. So it's trying to create these fortifications to stop unauthorized movements. And secondly, it seeks to recreate the terrain of the border in order to enable Border Patrol agents to do their job more effectively and efficiently. So the first aim, that is to fortify the border, is achieved not only through constructing a metal fence, and in many places this fence is double or even triple layered. But another important part of this process is to fill in virtually every ditch, gully, and culvert, and smooth over every fold, rise, and valley along the borderline. This is done to prevent migrants from utilizing variances in the local terrain in order to bypass the fence. The second aim, which is to refashion the terrain, is enabled by intensifying human control over local border topographies. So vales, gorges, dells, hollows, and other so-called irregular geological formations are subject to redesign according to the operational needs of Border Patrol. Both of these operational aims require the massive movement of dirt. The scope of this movement, as well as its relationship to thing power, I think can be seen or can be illustrated most in one of the most controversial sites for fence building, and that's Smuggler's Gulch, which is near San Diego. Smuggler's Gulch is a very old border crossing, and in the past, Border Patrol agents, they've had a really tough time at this site. It's marked by these treacherous dirt roads that are cut right into the sides of the valleys, and there's tons of switchbacks that crisscross through these valleys and canyons. This has created kind of a health and safety issue for many of the Border Patrol agents, as they were getting into all sorts of accidents when they were pursuing migrants because of these unsafe road conditions. So at a cost of $59 million, 100,000 dump truck loads filled the gulch and several other cross-border canyons. And here you can get these are some activists, environmental activists who were monitoring the filling in of Smuggler's Gulch, took these photographs of some of the dump truck activity. This is what's called a cut and fill project, which basically means that the tops of local mountains were blown off, leveled, and then the dirt that was produced from this cutting activity or this was used to fill the canyons and the gulches. So mountains, folds, elevations, smoothed over, canyons and valleys were filled in. To give you a sense of the scope of this project, one local San Diego newspaper calculated that the 2 million cubic yards of earth that were removed from these mountain tops is enough to fill the Empire State Building. So this is an enormous amount of dirt. The project is now completed, and concrete berms have been installed to bridge the two sides of Smuggler's Gulch. And so agents are now able to drive straight across, resulting in much quicker response times for apprehending unauthorized migrants. The movement of this dirt was enabled through various securitizations of the public policy process. Previous attempts to fill Smuggler's Gulch were unsuccessful. They were hampered by various environmental and conservation laws that protected the habitats of endangered and threatened species in the area. Of particular concern, only 400 feet away from Smuggler's Gulch is the Tijuana River National Estuary. So this for many years was a protected site. However, with the passage of the Secure Fence Act, the Department of Homeland Security was empowered this kind of power of exceptionalism, to make exceptions. It was allowed to apply waivers to various federal, state, and local laws and regulations that might stand in the way of fence building projects. And the Department of Homeland Security did precisely that. They waived all environmental and property laws that might regulate the project's implementation or impact. And the range of laws that were suspended included, among others, environmental reviews, water and wildlife protection, and laws regulating the use of farmland, historic sites, and Native American graves. I think one striking aspect of this construction is the way that it transforms the verticality of space into a kind of a pure horizontal. Let me explain what I mean by that. So the verticality, the natural elevations, folds, and bends of the landscape have been smoothed over and made level, as I think you can see through the photograph on the left. So the specificity of the local has been literally bulldozed over to make way for this kind of abstract geopolitical space of the international borderline. There have been a number of consequences to this move. One effect has been the erasure of history, context, and locality. People still refer to Smuggler's Gulch, but it really only exists in name. There are very, very few smugglers left, as migrants have been moved east for their border crossing attempts. And I think this is kind of an example of now the border has to follow the migrants because they're no longer crossing at this site. And I would just say as an aside, because of this drop-off in unauthorized crossings, well, much of the building of this gulch of filling in the gulch was justified in the name of protecting the workers who the Border Patrol agents from unsafe work conditions. Most of those Border Patrol agents have been laid off or fired because there's just no work for them in this space anymore. So that's an unintended consequence. Another consequence, and there's also no gulch to speak of. There's no smugglers, but there's no gulch either. There's only this leveled landscape now. Another consequence has been the terrible damage to the local habitat and the erosion of the complex ecological systems that run across this borderline. But here I think we can begin to see the relevance of thing power. And I think thing power is going to really come out more strongly in the second case. But here we see that the utilization of the material terrain, that is the dirt and soil of the area, as an ally in border policing, hasn't been fully co-opted, and it's taken turns that the human designers of this leveling project of Smuggler's Gulch have not expected and have not been able to entirely control. So, for example, the waiving of environmental laws has resulted in significant erosion of the new embankments that have replaced the canyons of Smuggler's Gulch. And San Diego, Tijuana, the whole Southern California, northern Mexico area has been, in recent years, been subject to heavy rainstorms, and it's now it's not uncommon for the dirt to slide off of these embankments. It's also becoming increasingly common to see other objects and things make their way across the border, as the excavation of the gulch didn't include proper flood channels. So I think this is one of the consequences or the blowback of waiving environmental reviews. So the use of the exception by the Department of Homeland Security has backfired in this respect. Erosion is now destroying the ecological habitat, it's polluting the beaches and waters of San Diego, and it's also threatening to contaminate the water supply of Tijuana. It's also undermining one of the key operational goals of the Secure Fence Act, which is to have this safe and efficient road for Border Patrol to police the movements of undocumented migrants. So you can see from the slide on the left, this is the new road, and this is what it looks like when it rains. So far from being this kind of efficient way for border agents to now drive their trucks and pursue migrants, it becomes an unusable road under certain weather conditions. On the right, you can see the massive amount of tires. Right here, you can see a water bottle. There's a soccer ball, I believe, over there. Just due south of Smuggler's Gulch is one of the major garbage dumps of Tijuana. And again, when these torrential rains come, a lot of the waste and garbage from this dump is making its way unimpeded and unchecked across the border and to pollute the beaches and surrounding area of San Diego. The second example of moving dirt that I look at is located at the Israel-Lebanon border zone. During the late 1990s, when the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon was coming to an end, much of the topsoil of the region was dug up with backhoes and taken by dump trucks to Israel for use in agriculture, orchards, and road building. The excavation left the surface level lowered by about a meter, and much of the terrain became pocketed with pits, some of them up to 3 meters deep. This act of soil theft on such a massive scale was largely unreported in the Western media, although the Lebanese parliament did issue complaints to the UN, to the Arab League, and to the Israeli parliament. After initially denying such acts of this soil theft, the Israeli government eventually admitted to the soil theft after some Beirut-based newspapers published before and after pictures of the affected area. The story got a bit of international attention, but not much. The Economist wrote a short piece on it, describing the landscape as, quote, an ugly open-cast mine. However, one of the most profound voices, so not many people have talked about this event, but one of the most profound voices to speak about this movement of dirt is not a human one, but that of a thing, an object. Now, this act of soil theft, I'll get to that object in a second, but this act of soil theft has some profound implications for the model of politics that's based on this equation between sovereignty, population, and territory. In its classic formulation, this model accords the capacity to move to the first two elements, to sovereignty and to population, and denies it to the third, which is territory. Sovereigns can move to the extent that their control over territory can extend or contract over time. In other words, the borderline might change, but it might, we might push it out. We might have to be forced to pull it in, but the territory remains static. Similarly, populations may move in and out of territory, either willingly or coerced, but the territory itself is again assumed to be the same. The story of the soil theft problematizes this kind of political equation. In this event, the earth itself becomes a protagonist. A sovereign did not extend its geopolitical borders and annex the land. Instead, it transferred the soil to its own territory. It's not the people who have been uprooted and displaced so much as the land beneath their feet. So it's the territory, the soil, the dirt itself that's been displaced. I think one of the most sophisticated analyses of this soil theft didn't come from a journalist or a political scientist, but it's actually come from an artist. Someone whose work I've been following for some time is Israeli photographer and experimental filmmaker Alana Salama Ortar, O-R-T-A-R, if you're interested. Back in the 1990s, late 90s, Ortar undertook a photo documentation of the Israel-Lebanon border zone. And it was then that she encountered these border cairns that were spread across the landscape, quite accidentally. She's communicated the findings of her travels and discoveries in a number of essays, interviews, photographic installations. She had a show at where I met her. She had a show in A Space Gallery downtown, and in a short film called Land Without Earth. So during her photo documentation, Ortar came across a number of these border cairns. These are markers. They were made of brick and stone, and they were placed in the ground by French and British military surveyors shortly after the First World War. The purpose of these cairns was to mark the borderline between the French mandate of Lebanon and the British mandate of Palestine. And like most colonial borders, they were drawn up far away by cartographers in London and Paris. And in the local context, of course, these borderlines made very little sense and came across as entirely arbitrary and externally imposed. So both the French and the British were concerned about solidifying the authority of their mandates, and so they placed these border cairns and symbolically anchored them deep into the local soil. So they became a symbol for where one colonial mandate began and another one ended. Ortar describes them as being monuments of the will of the great powers, and monuments that would actually outlast these so-called great powers themselves. So long after the French and British mandates expired, the border stones continued to exist as kind of a strange but now kind of familiar feature of the local landscape. In the wake of the soil theft, they took on new significance, and they emerged as key witnesses to the changing features of the landscape and their political meaning. In other words, the stones tell a story without words, but rather through the soil that is marked irregularly on them. These are some stills from that film, Land Without Earth. So similar to the changes enacted at Smuggler's Gulch, the border stone marks a shift in our perception from the horizontal to the vertical, both in time and in space. Space because our eye is no longer drawn to how the cairn distributes territory horizontally over separate geopolitical entities. It's no longer serving that original purpose of saying, on this side of the cairn it's the French mandate, and on the other side it's the British mandate. Instead, it marks the vertical loss of land, soil, and territory. When the colonial surveyors initially established a cairn, they would give it they thought that these mandates were going to last a long time, right? So they give it a really firm foundation. The whole bottom half of the cairn was deeply rooted into the earth. So what we can see, I wish it would show up on these photographs a bit better, but what you can see with the border cairns is that the bottom 3 feet of these cairns in the present day are colored differently. They have a red-brown color, which is identical to the dirt that once covered them. So the border cairn acts as what Ortar calls a kind of perpendicular marker or a geopolitical yardstick that demonstrates the drop in level of the surface. So the top bit of the border cairn is all weather stained, and it looks just like the surface area of the surrounding territory. But that bottom 3 feet is the same color as the soil. And so it gives witness to this drop in the level of soil. You can literally see the amount of territory, of dirt, of soil that's been stripped away. So in this way, the border stone, I think, disrupts the assumption of the seamless link between land and soil. Ortar has a wonderful quote about this. She says, "Here, the very idea of land has, so to speak, been split open and sapped of its substance. The empty husk of territory can be returned at no particular loss." In other words, the Israeli army, in leaving Lebanon, abandoned the territory but took its substance, it took its soil. The absence of what was, that is, the absence of this soil, is made present by the traces that are left onto the stone. So that's space. I also mentioned that this stone also speaks through time, temporally. And this is because it serves as a reminder of other past demarcations of the border, of geopolitical entities that no longer formally exist, the mandates of Lebanon and Palestine, and forms of authority that are no longer considered credible or legitimate, European colonial powers. So, if any of you have read the philosopher Jacques Rancière, one of his central claims in his political theory is that politics changes what people can see and hear. So I was interested, what power do objects have in this respect? What power do these border cairns have to enact a change in what we can see and hear? The border cairns are an example of, I think, a disruption by an object. On the one hand, their emergence, what Ortar calls, they have emerged as kind of inadvertent monuments in the landscape. They're kind of low down before, and now they're these tall monuments, 8 feet tall monuments. We can easily recognize that these kind of past borderings by the colonial powers is now arbitrary and illegitimate. But it raises this question, I think, about the present day. What does it say about present day border practices? So the border stone, as an object demonstrating a force of its own, marks a confusion. It's a disruption, it's an interruption. It creates confusion about a colonial past and the bordering practices of the present. Anyway, I'm going to stop here, I think. As I said, these are early formulations of this project, and I hope I've given some stuff for you folks to think about the power of objects in terms of this kind of thing power of objects, in terms of communicating certain kinds of stories within these contested border zones. And I hope it's contributed to this ongoing dialogue within the Critical Border Studies series. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much.